You were the chosen one!
Yeah, but what about dragons?
It was said that you would destroy the Sith, not join them!
But you're missing the most important thing. What about dragons?
You were my brother, Anakin!
What about dragons?
I loved you!
What about dragons? The What About Dragons shirt, which presents the most important question you will ever ask. Available through Teespring, link in the description. You're still forgetting the dragons. I forget the dragons, people. Dragons.
Shadowverse.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and welcome back to Fantasy Rearmed, where in this episode we will be looking at orcs. Now, I've already had a look at the best medieval weapons that an orc could use, or, it's better for them to use, based on their physical characteristics, where in this episode we're going to be taking that standard which we were able to establish in the previous episode and decide what is the best way for humans to fight these orcs if they are armed in this way. And if you're wondering the why did we pick the weapons that will be, trying to face up against the orcs, or that the orcs will be using, it's pretty good if you go watch the previous episode. Highly encourage it, and you will thoroughly enjoy it too if you haven't watched it already. And from that episode, we're able to establish that orcs, well, they like pretty meaty, nasty weapons. Specifically battlefield weapons like the poleaxe, war hammers, and even really big great swords. I was saying swords wouldn't be as common, but I was speaking more about arming swords and long swords. Great swords are very much a battlefield weapon. And I think orcs, they'd be carrying around some pretty big weapons all the time. But their best, like the weapon that, where their physical characteristics could really be employed to a very advantageous level, was in bows. Big, heavy, not even long bows, because orcs are so much stronger than humans, so these would be massively thick orc bows. And orcs don't seem to care about fighting fair. They're happy to shoot someone at a distance, and that can sometimes be at odds with, the concept of them loving the bloodlust rage and seeing the blood right in front of them and hacking people up and stuff like that. But in my mind, using bows at a distance actually isn't that far out of line with how orcs want to fight, especially if the orcs started to use a bit more tactics. So with the what understood, specifically the type of weapons understood, now we can look at how humans would be able to try and combat these creatures, and I'm going to be looking at two areas. One-on-one, like if it's one human versus one orc, and also larger scale battles. Let's start with the one-on-one, and this is a tricky one because there are so many subjective circumstantial things that will affect combat. Is the human a hero? Is he particularly skilled in one way or another? Does he have magic? Magic is basically, in any scenario or with any creature, whether it's orc, giants, and all the other creatures we'll be looking at in Fantasy Rearmed, if you have magic available, probably magic is going to be your best pick, depending on the strengths and limitations in the setting, because magic is always so different, but generally, unfortunately, magic is not portrayed with, defined rules, and it's more this airy-fairy, almost Deus Ex Machina device where magic can just do anything. But does the hero have magic at his disposal? So who knows? In this scenario, more often than not, even though magic will always be, if magic's available, use magic, right? In the scenario we're looking at, we're going to be trying to say the average human, maybe mildly, he's going to be very competent, this person, all right? They're going to be very competent in fighting. Not superheroic levels where their skill is just so great that they can kill hordes of orcs without even breaking a sweat, or jump on the back of, giants and do the Legolas joystick thing, which I mentioned in Fantasy Rearmed, How to Fight Giants. So average to little bit above average human. That can help us narrow down this discussion a little bit, but then we also have other circumstantial things that can affect, like terrain, okay? And terrain is going to be a big one, especially if the orc is going to want to use his favored and really most unfair weapon against anyone, this insanely powerful bow. Because if the orc can't see his target, he can't really shoot them, and terrain can be an issue. If you're in a thick, dense, wooded forest or whatever, yeah, it's going to be tough. But if you're in a more open field, but say if there's lots of hills, can you get cover behind, rises in the land? Does the orc know your position at a distance? Because if he knows your position, he might be able to lob arrows, though. Lobbing, arcing arrows with pinpoint accuracy is very difficult to, impossible if you're just trying to hit one target. The lobbing thing, in my mind, it would be more effective against a larger group where you just have to get the distance accurate and then you're going to hit someone. Well, of course, if you can get cover through terrain, you're going to do that. And I think employing certain tactics that we see in modern warfare, in fighting against people with firearms and stuff, you're probably going to be looking at tactics like that. Cover, maybe commando crawl a bit to close the distance to the point where you can use your own weapons against them. Now, if you have a bow, well, you might be able to hit them. But the thing is, orcs are generally always prepared for fighting because that's their culture. They love fighting. So in the previous video, we kind of established that it's very likely that they're always going to be wearing armor. Armor against bows. That's a debated topic, isn't it? So let me try and give you a summarized understanding of how effective ranged weapons, whether this is crossbows, bows, and when I say bows, I'm kind of trying, English longbows, war bows, hunting bows, so it changes a lot, right? So I'm going to try and summarize it as accurately as I can for you. And are these types of ranged weapons effective against armor? Yes, sometimes. Is armor really effective against blocking these ranged weapons? Yes, sometimes. It depends. This is the tricky thing. It's a complex kind of a subject. In regards to mail, all right, of course, ranged weapons have a much greater chance of penetrating mail-type armor, but it's not ever a guarantee. There's been tests done where even thick gambeson is able to stop longbow arrows, but then there are tests where longbow arrows are able to penetrate, so gosh, it's very, hit and miss. The type of arrowhead plays a very big role in it. Broadheads, much harder for broadheads to penetrate mail and gambeson underneath because, the head is thicker and much wider than the rings on the mail, which means it's harder to penetrate. But then you have like a bodkin arrowhead or something like that, much thinner, much, that's actually kind of engineered to penetrating mail, much higher chances of penetrating mail. So those are kind of summary subjective things with mail and gambeson armor. But what about plate? All right, so if I was to give my summarized understanding, most of the time, arrows will never be able to penetrate properly made plate armor. Impossible. But then you have circumstances where the armor might be a bit weathered and aged, it might be poorly made, and there are also areas on the armor that are less thick than other areas, and then you also have the gaps and joints. But more often than not, you're generally going to be mostly protected if you're wearing plate armor. And orcs, they can sometimes wear quite plated armor, but this is the thing. If the setting has orcs wearing armor, because of their culture, I think they'd be wearing armor more often than not. But if the setting doesn't have orcs wearing armor, because orcs are, in a lot of fantasy settings are depicted not wearing armor at all. They're the whole barbarian, shirtless Conan warrior types. And if orcs are not wearing armor, okay, ranged weapons is your best pick against them. Kill them at a distance, and I don't care how muscly they are, pin them with enough arrows, especially if you're penetrating vital organs, you will kill them. So pin cushion them at a distance and let them bleed out and die, and job's done. But if they're wearing armor, specifically plate armor, that's not going to work. And then you have the issue of trying to avoid the orcs' ranged fire, and their ranged fire is a lot more powerful. So powerful, in fact, in the previous episode, I kind of mentioned it might even be able to penetrate certain types of plate armor. The orc bow will be way more powerful, and they'd be able to shoot much thicker and heavier arrows and arrowheads. So with that in mind, we actually come to a very crucial weapon or defensive item that you would almost always want to have when fighting against orcs armed with their super powerful bows, because you wouldn't have a guarantee that your own armor would be able to protect you. And so this is interesting. Was there a circumstance in history where a fully armored knight, or even man-at-arms or whatever, was facing weaponry that could still harm him in that armor? Oh yes. Yes, there was. There were weapons specifically engineered and designed to really wreck knights in armor. And a lot of it is around blunt-forced weaponry. But we're looking at maces, poleaxes, and of course warhammers. So then what was the heavily armoured person, knight, whatever, meant to do when facing up against those types of armour? Oh, of course, lance strikes from horseback. They're also very dangerous to the guy in armour. What were they going to do? Well, in those cases, they would still carry a shield. This is where a shield is still a useful item even when you're so heavily armoured. Now, more often than not, you're going to be mostly protected. This armour, if it's full plate, is going to be really, really good and it frees up the offhand so you're, more free to use heavier two-handed weapons. So you see long swords, great swords, pole arms like halberds and poleaxes and stuff being used by heavily armoured knights. And so they could try their luck because they got a poleaxe, an enemy has a poleaxe, and you just fight poleaxe. But if you really were, worried about being damaged in this, there is a shield you would carry. And this is interesting because you see actually the three classic kind of shields right behind me because I've made replicas. You got the round shield there, you've got the glorious kite shield in the far corner over there, you've got the buckler there, but then you have the heater shield. You see, the heater shield is an awesome type of shield in that generally it depends because there's variance, of course. There's variance in all these shield designs in size and thickness and stuff like that. In this circumstance, you would want a heater shield. And interesting, heater shields are generally a bit smaller than the other shields. And again, variance, I'm speaking in generalities, and sometimes it might not even be a full generality, it just might be a circumstance in the way that this type of heater shield is specially built. But generally, heater shields are a bit thicker than the other shields, and so they're not necessarily lighter because they're smaller, because their thickness actually balances out the weight difference. And because they're so thick, they are able to block some of these really heavy blows. And so in my mind, right, one of the crucial bits of kit you will always want to make sure you have with you when fighting orcs is a thick heater shield or even a kite shield or round shield if you want that's built thick enough to absorb and block these crazy powerful arrows that are being shot at you by the orcs. Then you have the survivability factor kind of brought in, enough where you can close the distance or just get close enough to use your own ranged weapon. But hang on, what if you need the cover while you're using your ranged weapon? Aha! History has the answer as well. Because in history, there was a circumstance where a ranged kind of soldier had basically portable cover with him. And this is where we come to an interesting shield that is often misrepresented in fantasy, and it's called the Tower Shield. You see, the Tower Shield, there was no shield in history that was called specifically the Tower Shield, but there are shields that are kind of comparable to what one thinks as the Tower Shield, like the Roman Scutum. Now, the Roman Scutum might not be actually thick enough to protect yourself perfectly, and probably will obviously be able to protect you to a certain level, but could it protect you 100% from these crazy powerful bows and arrows? To an extent, but not nearly as effectively. If there's a properly made heater shield with as thick as they were made in history, in my opinion, I reckon a good heater shield would be able to block those arrows. Scutum, possibly, but there's actually a more specifically made type of shield that's meant to be used in conjunction with a ranged weapon. And it is a later period shield called the Pavis, or Pavese. I'm trying to copy Metatron's pronunciation because it's mentioned to me, and of course, he knows the pronunciation. He's Italian, all right, and he's a linguist. And so a Pavese is this really big tower-like shield, but it has this really intriguing design. It has kind of like a gutter riser in the middle, and that is made so you can actually place the shield down and it will generally stand by itself without you needing to do anything. And that means you run up with your shield, you place it down, and then you're behind it, and you have your crossbow, you load your crossbow, fire, and it's portable cover. The thing is, it might face some of the same potential flaws that a Roman Scutum has if it's not thick enough, because in my understanding, Paveses were not built as thick as certain heater shields could be built. So you might want to alter the design and make them thicker, but that means they're going to be crazy heavy. That's the difficult balance here. But this is a fairly good tactic, and it has some fairly good weapons that we can use. So if you're using ranged weapons, big tower-like shield, and honestly, I think Tower Shield is a fine name for the family of historical shields that fall in that category, like the Pavis or Pavese and Scutum. And if you're planning on using ranged weapons against the orc, tower shield. If you're, ballsy enough to go one-on-one, you need a shield that's not going to be overly heavy and too cumbersome. Therefore, you need to kind of scale it down in size and use a good old heater shield. There is another tactic that would be very, very useful in this circumstance, and it's a tactic that doesn't seem to be employed by orcs, really, in many fantasies that I can think of. And it's the use of cavalry. You see, when I think of fantasy, it's hard for me to think of orcs on cavalry. I mean, you say, what about wargs, But those are goblins. Goblins are usually the guys riding the wolves. Orcs, they're almost always on foot. And if there is a fantasy where, orcs are on something, a mounted whatever, that would actually strike me as an exception to the standard rule that orcs generally fight on foot. And if they're on foot, get on a horse, okay? If you're on a horse, it's going to make you harder to hit from this orc, arrow fire at a distance. You can still use a pretty decent heavy shield, and then you can start to employ some really significant weapons, because you can outpace it. A person on horseback versus a person on foot, you have a massive advantage. And even if this guy is super strong, okay, you can outpace him, all right? And then give yourself a weapon that outreaches this enemy as well. Lance, okay? That means it doesn't matter how strong they are, if they can't hit you, they can't employ their strength against you. The issue is the bow would be powerful enough that it probably could take out the horse, so don't get hit. So you're harder to hit, close the distance. If you can close the distance before you get hit from this big powerful bow, that's something to consider, isn't it? But in any situation, absolutely, heater shield or heavier, bigger shield is main pick for the type of weapon or kit you would want to use when fighting or facing up against an orc who's ready to use a really powerful bow against you. And even if it's even on top of that, really heavy two-handed weapons that the orc is probably using as well, you need something that can defend yourself against these really powerful offensive weapons that are being swung at you. And from this understanding, we can kind of move from the one-on-one circumstance to more larger scale battles, and a whole, army of orcs armed with these crazy powerful bows. Gosh, that's hard. But we've already been able to establish some pretty useful things in the one-on-one that transfers quite effectively to larger scale battles. Protection. So you need, a row of shields. This is where shield formations would come back in play and be quite useful. But interesting thing, right? These bows would be more effective in closer range, because that's when their power would be much, much greater. If they are arcing the bow, it just means that they have longer range, because as soon as that arrow reaches its peak kind of, height, its acceleration is only going to be as great as what gravity can accelerate it, and they're not going to match the power that they had when they were originally loosed from these really powerful bows. And so protecting yourself and your army from these powerful bows at longer distance in an arcing, if they're coming in from overhead, it would actually be easier because they would hit with less power than close range. So when you get in close range, that these bows would have a much greater chance of penetrating even paveses or scutums and such. And so you might just have to make ones that are thicker, because of course tower-like shields are much better to protect yourself against large volleys of arrow, because you can make those awesome, shield formations, and even the classic Roman one where you put them over top as well. But just being able to survive to close the distance to, get to these orcs, what are you going to do then? Okay, try to actually fight an orc army which are stronger than you, and they have and a greater endurance, well, it certainly seems like it, and more powerful weapons. Gosh, how could you take that on even when you're able to close the distance? You have to employ smarter tactics, okay? That's really the only way. If it's just a fair, same amount size orc army against a human, and they're of the same size, and there's no difference in terrain advantages or different like that, more often than not, the orcs are just going to wipe the floor with the humans. And so the humans need to employ smarter tactics. But we've already figured something out, that the orcs don't generally use cavalry. You see, I think if you employed cavalry to a really good extent, that means you would be able to do something, because you could flank them, get behind, where they're not facing it. And so if you have a unit of infantry armed with good shields and stuff to draw the arrow fire, and you have your cavalry further away, out of distance and even out of sight, so the orcs might not even know they're there, and have their infantry slowly approaching, drawing the arrow fire, and then hit them on the flanks or the rear with your cavalry, this is when you might be able to get some advantage over the orc in larger scale battles. The thing is though, you would need to hit them hard and you need to hit them fast, because as soon as they regain their composure and turn their bows on the cavalry, but if that happens and you're able to hit them really hard with the infantry, with a solid shield line, with long spears and stuff like that, or even pikes, keeping the orcs at a distance and then continually hitting them with the cavalry, you probably have a much better fighting chance. And so to summarize this tactic, it would be cavalry with infantry armed with big shields and long spears. And there we have it. Those are my picks. Those are how you would fight orcs if you were to try and consider it in a more realistic context, specifically with historical, medieval weapons and armor. So thank you for watching. This has been Fantasy Rearmed. I really do appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun. And of course, I hope to see you next time. And until then, farewell.